So welcome back. The epigenetic mechanism we've been talking about clearly demonstrates how profoundly environment can affect gene expression and phenotype in a long-lasting way. But aside the aforementioned risk of autism, how else could epigenetics change our mental state and behavior? We were talking about stress and the hormone cortisol. Well, people vary in their susceptibility to stress, don't they? Some find impending exams terrifying and others take them in their stride. What's the difference? Well, somewhere down in the cascade of events that is the production, control and reaction to the cortisol, stress-prone people must have different genes of epigenetics than phlegmatic folk. You may remember that in the previous lecture I mentioned that twin studies had shown that at least within the normal range, a family's parenting style and shared home environment have little to do with how the kids' personalities turn out. Variations of personality and intelligence in Western societies are due mostly to variations in genes rather than the environment. But remember, that previous lecture, we also talked about heritability not being a constant. So could it be that the environment is good enough in Western societies to bring out the genetic variation in people? Could it be that living in a developed society has prevented the scientists who do these studies from realizing just how much nurture plays a role in development? Given our helplessness as babies, we can never, of course, be left alone immediately after birth to fend for ourselves. But what degree of nurture must we receive in order to grow up to be productive members of society? When Western observers visited Romanian orphanages in the 1990s, they were shocked by the filth and health of the kids and the extreme maternal deprivation. Babies were left alone in their cots and got less than 6 minutes of stimulation a day. The infants were tiny, and exactly as you'd expect, they developed abnormal habits and social behaviour. They often sat and stared for long periods, or they walked back and forth for hours. Okay, well, a 15-year study in the United Kingdom followed up 165 of these children who spent their first 3 years in these dreadful institutions and had then been adopted into good homes. The study suggested that the first 6 months of deprivation were the most crucial, and longer durations of misery, strangely, did not make the kids much worse. To many people's surprise and relief, most of the major physical problems and most of the cognitive difficulties got better after adoption. Though many kids still showed elevated levels of cortisol and persistent problems with attachment, inattention, or autistic behaviour. There was some evidence that dopamine genes were involved in explaining which of the Romanian orphans were worse affected by inattention disorders. Now, I've mentioned dopamine before. It is the motivation chemical. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which seems to be about the anticipation of pleasure, about the pursuit of happiness. It's believed to be involved in eliciting goal-directed behaviour. It's been said that the word maybe is addictive, because if you feel that you're on top of things, that today, not like yesterday, you're not going to screw up, that today things might work out well if you take a shot at something, then dopamine levels are going to go way up. Monkeys produce a lot of dopamine when a reward is uncertain. If they're certain they'll get a reward, then dopamine won't go up as much because there is less anticipation. The neurochemistry of dopamine may explain why we work hard at school. It's because we anticipate getting a reward of some kind for getting educated, going to college or getting a good job or ending up retired on a fishing boat, a reward of some kind. Anyway, unlike other animals, humans can keep dopamine levels up for decades in anticipation of getting a reward. As an example of something uniquely human, there's evidence that dopamine facilitates religious belief systems by allowing people to anticipate a reward that comes even after their deaths. Your DNA and hormones can make it much more likely you'll be a religious believer. The obvious case is the Y chromosome, as it often is when it comes to our behaviour. Universally, worldwide, people with Y chromosomes are less likely to be religious, less willing to accept religion than women who don't have a Y chromosome. People with autism, people who live in little worlds of their own, and people with Asperger's syndrome. These are people who are often very functional and tend to be interested in one thing and good at numbers and the like. They're far less likely to be religious than anyone else. The sociability of people and their religiosity go strongly together. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that many of the Romanian kids had a lot of problems with sociability and motivation. But the weirdest result from this study was that about 20% of the children seem completely unaffected in any way whatsoever. Some children are clearly, staggeringly resilient to environment. Now, last week I mentioned studies suggesting that kids with different versions of various genes controlling neurotransmitters react differently to the same bad conditions. You may remember me talking about the serotonin transporter gene. It varies in humans, and this variation correlates with personality differences. But though these alleles as we say in genetics, correlate with behavior, they react with the environment differently in different kids. So clearly, some interactions must occur between the environment with its bad conditions and the genes in those kids most responsive to the bad conditions. Well, cortisol is very much a hormone that responds to the environment, and epigenetics is all about changes that occur in response to the external environment. So can the two be linked? Well, Mike Meany's lab in Montreal did some very clever experiments with rats that may reproduce the human experience. They noted that some rat mums extensively licked and groomed their pups, like the nice rat mum here. It's her way of saying she loves them. Where other rat mums, they ignored their pups. Pups that got a lot of licking during the first week of life grew up to be happy and calm, while those that were ignored grew up to be anxious and were more prone to disease. The differences in behavior were tracked down to a change in the cortisol receptor gene during development. At birth, the receptor gene in the hippocampus is highly methylated and inactive. Well, that's significant because, as I mentioned, the cortisol receptors in the hippocampus turn on the brakes which cuts off cortisol production. Well, if a rat mother does a lot of licking, the pup's receptor gene gradually loses the methyls, making the gene more active so more receptors are produced. When enough cortisol is bound by receptors, the hippocampus sends out signals that turn off cortisol production. The more receptors there are, the more quickly that happens. So these pups, therefore, are going to be more relaxed in response to stress because they can quickly put the brakes on cortisol production. The researchers also found that nurturing traits tended to carry on to the next generation. High-licking mums had daughters that went on to lick and groom their own litters more frequently than the daughters of low-lickers. But interestingly, when they took the offspring of a low-licking mother and had it raised by a high-licking one, the rat adopts the high-licking behavior when it has babies of its own. These rats, therefore, take on the behavior of their adoptive parents. Well, this suggests that we are looking at an epigenetic, not a genetic cause. Now, it's difficult to directly correlate results from rats to humans. However, a study was conducted on hippocampal tissue in people that had committed suicide. Some had been abused as children, and some had no history of child abuse. The subjects that had been abused had decreased levels of cortisol receptor protein. That's consistent with the rat data, that it is the early childhood interactions which cause epigenetic changes leading to adult behavior. Other less extreme human studies also back up this research. One such study found that children whose biological mothers were prone to depression were more prone to fussy behavior, but only if their adopted mothers were not nurturing. Well, that suggests that nurturing parenting compensated for their predisposition towards unhappiness.